The double doors to Trauma Bay 3 slammed open so hard they rattled the frame. The sound snapped through the night shift haze like a starter pistol, and the entire room turned in the same instant toward the gurney being driven in at a run. The paramedics' shoes squeaked on the polished floor. The monitors were already chirping as the team reached for leads and cuffs and tubing like they were pulling a patient back from the edge with their bare hands. On the stretcher lay a man who looked wrong for a hospital bed, not because he wasn't sick, because he looked like the kind of person who normally never ended up helpless. Mid-40s, broad shoulders even in a thin hospital blanket, close-cropped hair, a jaw set like it was used to issuing orders rather than receiving them. An oxygen mask fogged faintly with each tight breath, and even through the plastic you could see his mouth trying to hold pain in place with sheer will. Two men in plain clothes flanked the gurney like shadows with military posture. They didn't touch the stretcher. They didn't speak unless spoken to. But the way their eyes moved, scanning exits and corners and lines of sight, made the air feel smaller. At the foot of the bed, near the supply cart where extra gloves and gauze were stacked in tidy squares, a nurse stood with her hands folded at her waist. She was small, almost swallowed by her navy scrubs, hair pinned back with a plain clip, no bright sneakers, no jingling badge reels, no dramatic entrance, just stillness. Her name badge read, EUNJI Park RN. A senior resident stepped into the room with the confident stride of someone who believed the building existed to affirm his talent. Dr. Caleb Rourke was tall, clean-cut, and loud enough that people sometimes mistook volume for leadership. He looked right past Yunji as if she were part of the wall. "Okay, move," he said, snapping on gloves. "Let's get respiratory, page radiology, and I want CT angio in 10. We're ruling out PE dissection, all of it. This is high priority." The charge nurse, Valerie Tompkins, didn't flinch. Valerie had run trauma bays for decades and had the kind of authority that didn't need shouting. She adjusted the blood pressure cuff with practiced hands. "We stabilize first. Dr. Harrow is on his way." Rourke made a sound like a laugh that wasn't funny. "We don't have time for your process." Valerie's eyes stayed on the monitor. "My process keeps people alive." One of the plainclothes men leaned in, voice low. "He needs to stay conscious." Valerie looked up. "We'll do our best." The man's stare was flat, unblinking. "No, you don't understand. He needs to stay conscious." Valerie's patience showed the faintest crack. "Sir, this is a level 1 trauma center. We understand emergencies." The man's gaze slid past her shoulder and locked onto Yunji. For the first time, something changed in his face. A flicker of recognition, a kind of relief that didn't belong in a hospital. He took one step closer, not toward Valerie, not toward the doctors, but toward the quiet nurse standing near the cart. "Ma'am," he said softly, and somehow the word sounded like a salute. "We weren't sure you'd be here." Rourke's mouth twitched. "Ma'am." The man didn't even glance at him. He kept his eyes on Yunji and lowered his voice further, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile balance the room was holding. "Callsign," he whispered. "Whisper." For a heartbeat, the beeping monitors seemed to fade into the background. The patient's eyes fluttered, finding Yunji as if he'd heard that word too. Yunji shifted her weight, and when she finally spoke, it was quiet but steady in a way that made the chaos feel suddenly manageable. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. Pause. Yunji Park had learned early that being quiet didn't mean being weak. In hospitals, quiet often got translated into easy to ignore. Quiet nurses were expected to absorb the hardest assignments without complaint, to accept being interrupted mid-report, to have their observations repeated by louder voices and suddenly treated as genius. Yunji didn't play those games. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't slam charts, she didn't trade sarcasm in the break room. She did her work with meticulous care and went home to a small apartment in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood where the walls were mostly bare. The only personal thing anyone might notice, if they were invited inside, was a single framed photograph tucked on a shelf like something she didn't want to advertise. A younger Yunji in a uniform that wasn't hospital-issued, standing in a sun-bleached place with a helmet under her arm and her face half-shadowed. No one at Harborview Medical Center had ever seen it. No one at Harborview Medical Center knew what whisper meant. To the residents, Yunji was the quiet one. Useful, efficient, the kind of nurse you assign to complex patients because she wouldn't make it about herself. To Valerie Tompkins, Yoon. I was competent but strangely guarded. Valerie had tried to pull her into the unit's social orbit, inviting her to potlucks, nudging her toward the group chat where nurses vented about doctors and swapped memes to survive the night shift. Yoonji always smiled politely and declined. To Dr. Mason Harrow, the attending trauma surgeon who ran nights like a battlefield commander, Yoonji was an anomaly. Harrow respected discipline. He respected nurses who could anticipate the next step before he spoke it. Yoonji did that consistently. But she also did something that unsettled him. She refused to perform. She never bragged, never tried to impress, never played the hierarchy game. In a place built on hierarchy, that could look like weakness to the wrong people. The wrong people like Dr. Caleb Rourke. Rourke was a senior resident with a year left, already talking like a future chief. He had the kind of confidence that came from being told he was brilliant since he was 12. He was photogenic, charming when he wanted to be, and loud in the way hospital culture sometimes rewarded. He also had a habit of turning uncertainty into blame. When things went wrong, Rourke didn't ask what he missed. He asked who failed him. He'd been on Yoonji's case since her first week in the trauma unit. It started small. "Sweetheart," he'd say in front of patients, then grin like it was friendly. "You sure you understand what we're doing?" he'd ask, as if she'd wandered in from a different profession. If Yoonji offered an observation, he'd wave it off and then later repeat it to the attending with different wording. Once, in the middle of a chaotic shift, Yoonji had quietly pointed out that a patient's blood pressure trend was concerning. Not dramatic, not crashing, just a subtle downward drift that meant something if you knew what to look for. Rourke didn't even look at the chart. "It's fine, he's anxious." An hour later, the patient crashed. They saved him, barely. Rourke wrote in the notes that the deterioration was sudden and unexpected. He did not mention Yoonji's earlier warning. Later, Yoonji passed by the break room and heard Rourke laughing with another resident. "If she wants to play doctor," he said, "she should go to med school." She paused outside the door with her coffee in her hand. For a moment, her face was still, like a lake holding its surface. Then she walked away without a word. That refusal to engage became its own kind of provocation. People like Rourke didn't know what to do with someone they couldn't rattle. They mistook restraint for submission. Yoonji let them, because she'd learned something else long before she ever wore scrubs. The moment you show your full capability in the wrong room, you lose control of the narrative. So she stayed quiet. She documented everything. And she waited. There were breadcrumbs, though, for anyone paying attention. The first was her hands. They were steady in a way that wasn't just experience. Plenty of nurses had steady hands, but Yoonji's steadiness had an edge of readiness, like her body had learned to stay calm in louder, sharper emergencies than a hospital could offer. The second was her language. She spoke English fluently, but every so often, when she thought no one was listening, she'd murmur quick phrases into her phone in Korean that didn't sound like casual conversation. Short, precise, like check-ins. The third breadcrumb was the way certain patients responded to her. Veterans especially. There was an older man with severe COPD who'd been furious at everyone, refusing treatments, snapping at staff, threatening to leave against medical advice. Valerie had tried. Respiratory had tried. A resident had tried and only escalated him. Yoonji walked in, pulled a chair close, and spoke softly to him. Nobody knew what she said. The man's shoulders dropped. He didn't suddenly become cheerful, but he stopped fighting and let them help him. Afterward, he told Valerie, "That nurse, she talks like someone who's been in the dust." Valerie had laughed. Lots of people have had hard lives. But she'd watched Yoonji a little more carefully after that. One night in the elevator, Valerie asked casually, "So, Yoonji, you ever serve?" Yoonji's eyes flicked up, sharp for a split second. Then the polite smile returned. "I served," she said, "in my own way." Valerie didn't press, but the question stayed with her. If you're already feeling the tension building, and you want more long, cinematic, fully fictional stories where competence gets underestimated and then vindicated, take a second to tap like. It tells me you're in for the slow burn payoff that's coming. Pause. The call that brought the gurney into Bay 3 didn't come through the normal channels. It started as an alert on Valerie's phone, incoming high-priority patient. ETA 6 minutes, security requested. Security requested was unusual but not unheard of. Police sometimes escorted prisoners. Occasionally you'd get a celebrity, sometimes an overdue. See case with a volatile crowd. Then a second message followed immediately. No media. No hospital-wide announcement. Restricted access. Hold bay. Valerie stared at it, then marched toward Dr. Harrow's office. Harrow was half eating something over a chart, the kind of meal you forgot you were having because your brain never stopped. He read the messages and his expression tightened. Who authorized restricted access? Valerie asked. Harrow's jaw worked once. Not sure. Should I push back? He kept looking at the screen like it was a riddle. Not yet. Clear the bay. They cleared Bay 3. Yoonji didn't ask questions. She helped set up, checked the airway cart, verified suction, ensured the crash cart was stocked, and quietly asked blood bank to stand by for potential massive transfusion protocol, just in case. Rourke noticed and smirked. Someone's eager tonight. Yoonji didn't look at him. Rourke leaned closer to Valerie. What is this, secret patient? Are we doing spy stuff? Valerie's eyes narrowed. Wash your hands and stay out of the way until we know what's coming. Rourke lifted both palms, grinning. Yes, ma'am. But he wasn't the type to stay out of the way. When the patient arrived, Rourke inserted himself into the center like oxygen belonged to him. He started calling orders before the paramedics finished their report. The paramedic's voice was clipped. Male, mid-40s, collapsed during physical exertion, complains of chest pressure, dizziness, shortness of breath. Vitals unstable en route, improved with oxygen. No obvious trauma, no known allergies, med list unknown. Rourke snapped. Any meds given? Oxygen only. Rourke cursed under his breath like the world was personally inconveniencing him. Yoonji stepped forward and spoke softly to the patient. Sir, can you tell me your name? His eyes flickered beneath heavy lids. He was conscious, barely, and the effort of staying that way was visible in the tightness around his eyes. His gaze found Yoonji and held. It wasn't the usual patient look of fear or confusion. It was something else, recognition of a kind of steadiness he trusted. His voice came out strained. Need air, stay awake. Yoonji nodded once. You're doing it, stay with me. Rourke scoffed. We're not a meditation retreat, we need information. Yoonji didn't react to the insult. She watched the monitor, heart rate elevated, blood pressure borderline, oxygen saturation rising with supplemental oxygen, but his breathing pattern was controlled, clipped, like he was fighting a deeper problem. She leaned closer to him. Any history, heart issues? One of the plainclothes men answered. No known cardiac history. Yoonji turned slightly. You're his. Security detail, the man said. He didn't offer a name. Rourke's eyebrows lifted. Detail for who, the mayor? No answer. Valerie moved to start an IV. Let's get EKG, troponin labs, chest x-ray. Rourke waved her off. I want CT angio, we're not wasting time. Wait, Yoonji said. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room. Rourke turned toward her slowly, as if he couldn't believe a nurse had dared to interrupt him. Excuse me. Yoonji met his eyes without flinching. His skin is cool, his pulse pressure is narrowing, he's compensating, he may not tolerate transport. Rourke snorted. And you diagnosed that with your feelings. Yoonji didn't take the bait. She pointed to the monitor, calm. He's borderline, we stabilize, then move. Rourke opened his mouth to retort, but the patient's hand lifted weakly, fingers twitching like he was trying to signal something. His eyes fixed on Yoonji. Yoonji leaned in. What is it? The patient swallowed, phone pocket black. One of the security men reached into the patient's jacket that had been draped over the gurney. He pulled out a black phone in a rugged case, the kind used in the field. He looked uncertain, then held it out to Yoonji, not Valerie, not the doctors. Rourke stared. Why are you giving it to her? The man's eyes stayed on Yoonji, because he asked. Yoonji took the phone and saw the lock screen. A single contact pinned at the top, labeled with one word. Command. She didn't hesitate, she pressed it. The phone rang once. Then a voice came through, low and controlled. "This is Commander Reyes." Yoonji's tone stayed even. "Commander, this is Nurse Park at Harborview. Your patient is in Trauma Bay 3. He's conscious but unstable. We're working him now." There was a fraction of silence, like a calculation happening on the other end. Then quietly, whisper. Yoonji's throat tightened just enough to notice. "Yes." "Keep him awake," Reyes said. "I'm 2 minutes out." The line went dead. The room had shifted, not because people suddenly understood. Because they suddenly sensed they were standing near something they hadn't been respecting. And that ignorance was about to become very expensive. And that's when the room changed. Pause. By the time Dr. Mason Harrow strode into Bay 3, the energy was Al. Ready tight as wire. Harrow took in the scene in one glance. The patient's guarded breathing, the presence of 2 security men, the cluster of staff hovering like they were afraid to get in the wrong person's way. He registered Rourke's posture too, expanded, confident, claiming space. Harrow stepped to the bedside. Status. Valerie began the report. Male, mid-40s, collapsed during exertion, chest pressure, dizziness. O2 sats improved with oxygen. Blood pressure borderline, EKG pending. Rourke cut in. "I'm ordering CT angio." Harrow didn't look at him. "We're ordering an EKG and bedside echo first. We're not sending an unstable patient down the hall because you want a clean diagnosis." Rourke's mouth tightened. "With respect, Dr. Harrow, delay." "Respect isn't the word you're looking for," Harrow said calmly, and now he did look at Rourke. "Start the workup. Keep your ego out of my bay." Rourke flushed. Yoonji moved smoothly, placing leads, drawing blood, speaking to the patient in a low voice that seemed to anchor him. "Sir, you're at Harborview," she said. "You're safe. Stay with me." The patient's eyes flicked toward the security men, then back to Yoonji. "Need Reyes." "He's coming," Yoonji said. Harrow glanced at her sharply. "You spoke to someone." Yoonji didn't hesitate. "Commander Reyes," he said. "He's 2 minutes out." Harrow's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Commander." It wasn't a question. It was a note being filed away. The EKG printer spat paper. Valerie held it up. Harrow's eyes moved over it fast, then slower. "That's not straightforward." Rourke leaned in. "Could be artifact, let's just CT." Yoonji's hand lifted, pointing to the patient's face. "He's getting more pale." Harrow looked. The patient's lips had lost color. Sweat beaded at his temples. His breathing stayed controlled, but the effort was increasing. Harrow's voice snapped into command mode. "Bedside echo, now." They wheeled in the ultrasound. Yoonji positioned the patient, careful and efficient. The image flickered on the screen, grainy shapes that meant nothing to untrained eyes and everything to the right ones. Harrow's expression shifted. Valerie saw it and felt her stomach drop. "What is it?" Harrow's voice lowered. "Pericardial effusion. He's got fluid around the heart, tamponade physiology." Rourke blinked, "But there's no trauma." Harrow's eyes stayed on the screen. "Not all tamponade is trauma. We need to relieve it before he arrests." Rourke swallowed. "We can do pericardiocentesis." Harrow nodded once. "We can and we will," Valerie prepped Yoonji. He paused like he was deciding something. "Yoonji, you're with me on the needle." Rourke's head snapped up. "Doctor, she's a nurse." Harrow didn't look away from the monitor. "She's the nurse I'm choosing." Yoonji's face didn't change, but her hands were already moving, opening sterile packs with calm precision. The room watched her, and some part of them noticed something. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look excited. She looked ready. Rourke muttered, "This is insane." Yoonji heard him. She didn't react. Harrow guided the needle under ultrasound, careful, controlled. The patient's eyes were open, fixed on Yoonji like she was the one thing in the room he could trust. Yoonji leaned closer. "Stay with me," she said again. The needle advanced. The air felt like it stopped. Then release. Fluid began to draw back into the syringe. Dark but not sensational, just clinical reality. The patient's breathing eased almost immediately. The monitor stabilized, numbers shifting in the right direction. A collective exhale moved through the room like wind. Valerie whispered, almost involuntarily, "Good catch." Harrow withdrew the needle and secured the line. "We just bought him time." Rourke stared as if the universe had insulted him. He looked at the patient, then at Harrow, then at Yoonji. "You got lucky," he said quietly, venomous. "If you'd been wrong." Yoonji met his eyes calm, "But I was." It was the first direct thing she'd said to him in weeks. It landed like a stone. If you want to keep writing this story with me, subscribe right now so you don't miss the moment when all the people who dismissed Yoonji have to face what they ignored. We're not even close to the payoff yet. Pause. The immediate crisis eased, but the tension didn't. Because the moment the patient stabilized, the hierarchy returned, like a tide rolling back in. Rourke moved to reclaim control. "Okay, now we transport. We still need CT to identify source of effusion. Could be malignancy, could be dissection. We need the workup." Harrow nodded, but his eyes were distant. "We'll get imaging once he's more stable." Rourke's lips pressed into a line. "If he deteriorates because we delayed." Valerie's voice sharpened. "You're not going to blame the nurse for your impatience." Rourke ignored her and turned to Harrow again. "I'm documenting that I recommended CT immediately." Harrow's gaze snapped back. "Caleb, if you document anything, document the truth. We stabilized him appropriately." Rourke's face tightened, but he didn't back down. "Fine." He pivoted, and as he did, his shoulder brushed Yoonji's arm, harder than necessary. It was subtle, the kind of contact you could pretend was accidental. Yoonji didn't flinch. But Valerie saw it. Harrow saw it too, his eyes narrowing. Then the plainclothes men stiffened. Not at the contact, at the sound of footsteps approaching fast. The doors swung open again. A man entered wearing civilian clothes that couldn't hide his bearing. Tall, lean, close-trimmed beard, eyes that seemed to calculate everything in the room at once. He moved with a controlled urgency that made nurses instinctively step aside. Commander Daniel Reyes. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. One of the security men nodded once. "Sir." Reyes went straight to the bedside, eyes on the patient. "How are you?" The patient's eyes shifted toward him. "Still here." Reyes leaned close. "Stay that way." Then his gaze moved to Yoonji. The room watched, confused, as the commander's expression changed. Not gratitude the way families showed it. Not relief the way colleagues showed it. Something deeper. He stepped toward her, just enough that people had to notice. His voice dropped, but it carried anyway because the room had gone quiet. "Whisper," he said. Yoonji's eyes held his. "Commander." Reyes nodded once like he was confirming something real. "Thank you." Rourke let out a small laugh of disbelief. "Commander, are we really calling nurses by nicknames?" Reyes turned toward him slowly, the way a man turns toward a sound he doesn't like. "Doctor, is it?" Rourke straightened. "Dr. Rourke, senior resident." Reyes studied him for a beat. "Good, then you'll understand chain of command." Rourke blinked. "This is a hospital, the chain of command is." Reyes cut him off with calm precision. "The chain of command is whoever is keeping my man alive." The patient's eyes closed briefly, like the effort of being conscious was heavy. Reyes's voice softened. "Who did the pericardiocentesis?" Harrow stepped forward. "I did." Reyes nodded. "And who flagged tamponade physiology before he arrested?" Harrow hesitated. His gaze flicked to Yoonji. "The room followed it." Harrow said carefully. "Nurse Park identified the trend and recommended stabilization before transport." Reyes looked at Yoonji again, and there was no question in his eyes. He already knew. He leaned slightly toward her, voice low enough that only those close could hear. "You still have your headset?" Yoonji's throat tightened. "No, I left that life." Reyes's eyes didn't harden, they softened just a fraction. "Life didn't leave you." Valerie's brow furrowed. Harrow's eyes narrowed. Rourke looked like someone had spoken a language he didn't understand in his own house. Reyes straightened and addressed Harrow. "We need to know why he developed the effusion." Harrow nodded. "We'll do imaging, consult cardiology, and run labs. We'll get there." Reyes's voice stayed calm. "Do it quietly, no media, no chatter." Rourke bristled. "Excuse me, but we can't just." Reyes turned toward him again, and this time his tone carried an edge. "Doctor, you are not the center of this room, act like it." The words weren't shouted. They were worse than shouting, because they were delivered like a fact. And Rourke, for the first time, didn't have a comeback. Pause. For the next hour, the trauma bay ran like a machine. Yoonji coordinated with Valerie, moved between tasks without wasted motion, and kept the patient anchored. Harrow ordered the imaging and consulted cardiology. Respiratory adjusted oxygen. Labs ran. Commander Reyes stayed close, but he didn't interfere. He watched like someone trained to read systems, not just people. Rourke hovered like a man who couldn't decide whether to fight or retreat. He chose neither. He waited. And waiting gave him time to plan how to regain control. The patient's name, they learned, was Adrian Cross. The chart listed him as a consultant, no employer named, no family contact listed. The address was a P.O. box. Even his date of birth looked like it had been entered without certainty. Valerie frowned. This chart is thin. Yoonji didn't comment, but she noticed the way the security men shifted when the name was spoken. Cross, not a random patient. A protected one. Imaging finally came back with a clue. No obvious dissection, no pulmonary embolism, but there was evidence of inflammation. Signs that suggested pericarditis, an inflammatory process leading to effusion. The cardiologist on call, Dr. Lena Patel, arrived, sharp-eyed and brisk. She reviewed the images and the echo. This is significant effusion. He's at risk of recurrence. We need to figure out etiology. Harrow nodded. We're admitting to ICU. Reyes asked, what's your plan? Patel spoke like she was briefing a leader. Monitor closely, drain if needed, anti-inflammatory therapy depending on cause, but we need H. History, exposures, infections, autoimmune markers. Something triggered this. Reyes's eyes flicked across, then to Yoonji. He doesn't have a history we can share. Patel frowned. Then we're working blind. Yoonji spoke quietly. We can still watch the trends. Patel looked at her, taking her in. You're his nurse. Yes. Patel nodded once. Then keep him on your radar. He's not a patient we can afford to lose. Rourke's jaw tightened at the we, the inclusion, the implied respect. When Patel stepped aside to write orders, Rourke moved toward the nurse's station where Yoonji was documenting. He leaned close enough to feel like a threat, enjoying your little moment. Yoonji kept typing, I'm working. Rourke's voice dropped. You're a nurse. Don't get confused because a man in civilian clothes called you a nickname. Yoonji's fingers paused, then resumed. It wasn't a nickname. Rourke's nostrils flared. Whatever it was, it doesn't change your place here. Yoonji finally looked up. Her eyes were calm, not cold. Calm, like someone who had stood in worse rooms than this and survived by staying centered. My place is where the patient needs me, she said. Rourke's smile was thin. We'll see how long that lasts. He walked away, but he didn't let it go. Because people like Rourke didn't tolerate being corrected by someone they considered beneath them. They escalated. Pause. The injustice didn't come like a punch. It came like paperwork. It started with a complaint filed before Yoonji's shift ended. Valerie found it first. An incident report typed in careful language that sounded professional until you read it with a real nurse's eyes. It claimed Yoonji had overstepped her scope, countermanded physician orders, and created confusion that delayed diagnostic imaging. Valerie stared at the screen in disbelief. This is nonsense. Harrow read it and frowned. Who filed it? Valerie's lips pressed tight. Rourke. Harrow's eyes narrowed. He's protecting himself. Valerie's voice sharpened. No, he's attacking her. Harrow leaned back, exhaling through his nose. We can address this. Valerie looked at Yoonji across the station. Yoonji was still documenting, as if she didn't know her name was being turned into a problem. Valerie walked over and spoke softly. Yoonji, did you know he filed an incident report? Yoonji's eyes flicked up, then back to the screen. I assumed he would. Valerie blinked. You assumed. Yoonji's voice stayed even. He doesn't like being corrected. Valerie's anger flared hot. This is not okay. Yoonji finally looked up. Valerie, it's fine. It is not fine, Valerie snapped, then caught herself. It's not fine. Yoonji's expression didn't change. I documented my observations. The timeline will show it. Valerie's anger didn't ease, it deepened. You shouldn't have to fight this. Yoonji's voice was soft. I know. That softness was what made it worse. Because Yoonji wasn't surprised, she was prepared. And that meant she'd lived in a world where doing the right thing didn't guarantee you'd be treated right afterward. Rourke didn't stop with paperwork. During rounds the next morning, with new residents and nurses listening, he brought up the case like it was a teaching opportunity. Last night, he said, we had a near miss due to delayed imaging. Important reminder, nurses should communicate concerns, but physicians make final decisions. Yoonji stood at the back of the group, quiet. Valerie's hands curled at her sides. Harrow's face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. Rourke continued, smiling like he was being helpful. It's easy to get emotionally attached to dramatic cases, but we must remain objective. Objective, as if Yoonji's calm was emotional and his panic was science. After rounds, Rourke approached Harrow privately. We need to address the scope issue. Harrow's voice was cold. What we need to address is your ego. Rourke's smile vanished. I'm protecting patient safety. Harrow leaned forward slightly. No, you're protecting your pride. Rourke's voice stayed controlled, but his eyes flashed. If you let nurses undermine physician authority, you create chaos. Harrow's gaze didn't move. If you punish nurses for saving patients, you create something worse. Rourke left jaw tight. And that afternoon, Yoonji was called into administration. Not by Harrow, not by Valerie. By nurse manager Danielle Sloan, a woman who wore polished professionalism like armor and had learned how to keep the hospital's liability risk low. Yoonji sat across from Danielle in a small office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and printer toner. Danielle folded her hands. Yoonji, we have a concern. Yoonji's posture was straight. I read the report. Danielle blinked. You did. Yoonji nodded. Valerie told me. Danielle cleared her throat. The report states you delayed imaging by challenging a physician's plan. Yoonji's tone stayed calm. I recommended stabilization. The attending agreed. Danielle's eye flicked down to her notes. Still, it's been framed as. Framed, Yoonji repeated softly. Danielle's lips tightened. This is serious if a physician feels undermined. Yoonji's voice stayed even. If a physician feels embarrassed, they can frame it as undermining. Danielle's eyes widened. That's not what I said. Yoonji leaned forward a fraction. Then we should look at the facts, the monitor trends, the echo, the timeline of orders, my documentation, Dr. Harrow's decisions. Danielle hesitated. We will review it. Yoonji nodded once. Good. Danielle's tone shifted, becoming more formal. In the meantime, I'm placing you on administrative leave pending review. For the first time, something flickered across Yoonji's face. Not panic. Surprise. Not because she didn't think it was possible. Because she'd underestimated how quickly they'd move. Valerie exploded when she heard. Harrow's jaw clenched so hard his cheek jumped. Rourke, in the hallway, pretended to look concerned. Sometimes, he said to another resident loud enough to carry, people don't know their limits. Yoonji walked past him without looking at him. Her hands were still steady, but inside something was tightening, like a knot pulled one notch closer. If you're feeling that injustice spike, comment what you think Yoonji should do next. Should she fight quietly with documentation, or should she finally confront the system head-on? I read those comments, and they shape which stories I tell next. Pause. Administrative leave didn't mean rest. It meant silence. It meant being removed from the place where Yoonji had control, where competence spoke louder than politics, and being placed in a limbo where other people wrote the story. Yoonji went home and sat at her kitchen table, the city's gray daylight pressing through the window like damp fabric. Her phone buzzed. Valerie, this is wrong, Harrow's furious. Yoonji replied simple, I know. Valerie called immediately. No, you don't understand, this is bigger. Sloan is making it official, they're treating you like a risk. Yoonji's voice stayed steady. I'm not a risk, I'm a nurse who kept a patient stable. Valerie's voice shook with anger. Then why are you the one being punished? Yoonji didn't answer right away. Because there was an answer, and it wasn't kind. People punished what they couldn't control. Valerie lowered her voice. Hera wants to pull you into a formal appeal. Yoonji's gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the shelf, the one she never showed anyone. He shouldn't waste political capital on me. Valerie went quiet. Yoonji, why do you talk like that? Yoonji's voice softened. Because I've seen what happens when people with power decide you're inconvenient. Valerie swallowed. Are you going to tell me what whisper means? Yoonji's eyes closed briefly. No. Valerie exhaled, frustrated but respectful. Fine, but listen, Commander Reyes called the hospital. Yoonji's eyes opened. He did. Yes, Valerie said, and administration is suddenly very nervous. They're asking questions they never ask about normal patients. Yoonji's throat tightened. What questions? Valerie's voice dropped. Who was on the team? Who made what decisions? Who spoke to whom? Yoonji stared at the table. They're building a narrative. Valerie's voice sharpened. We're going to stop them. Yoonji's expression stayed controlled. Valerie, don't burn yourself. Valerie's laugh was bitter. Too late, I've been burnt for less than this. At least this is worth it. After the call, Yoonji sat in silence. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered, hello. A familiar voice, low and controlled. Yoonji, it's Reyes. Yoonji's posture straightened. Commander. Reyes didn't waste words. They put you on leave. Yoonji didn't ask how he knew. Yes. Reyes' tone tightened. Because you saved Cross. Yoonji's voice was quiet. Because I embarrassed someone. Reyes exhaled slowly. I'm coming to Seattle administration in 1 hour. I want you present. Yoonji's jaw tightened. They won't allow it. Reyes' voice was calm in a way that carried weight. They will. Yoonji hesitated. Commander, I. Reyes cut in, not harsh but firm. Whisper, this is not a request. Yoonji's eyes flicked to the photograph again. I'm not that person anymore. Reyes' voice softened. You never stopped being that person, you just stopped letting people see it. A pause, the kind where the past presses close. Then Reyes said, Cross asked for you, he remembers your voice. Yoonji's throat tightened. He remembers. Reyes answered quietly, he trusts it. The line went dead. Yoonji sat still. Then finally she stood. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn object wrapped in cloth. Not a weapon, not anything dramatic. A patch. Black and subdued, the kind meant not to be seen from a distance. It had a simple symbol and a callsign stitched in small letters. Whisper. Yoonji held it in her palm for a long moment, feeling the weight of a life. She'd tried to bury. And that's when the room changed, even though she was alone. Pause. Hospital administration lived in a different world than the trauma bay. The trauma bay was urgency, sweat, and sound. Administration was carpet, glass, and silence. When Yoonji arrived, she wasn't in scrubs. She wore plain clothes, hair still pinned back the same way, faced the same calm mask. But her hands felt different, like they remembered something older than charting. Valerie met her outside the conference room. Her eyes widened in relief. You came. Yoonji nodded. Reyes asked. Valerie swallowed. He's already inside. Dr. Harrow stood nearby, arms folded, expression hard. When he saw Yoonji, his eyes softened a fraction. You shouldn't have been put on leave. Yoonji's voice was quiet. It happened. Harrow's jaw clenched. No, it was done. Before Yoonji could respond, the conference room door opened. Danielle Sloan stood there, face composed. Behind her, Yoonji saw the hospital's risk management attorney, a man in a tailored suit with a thin smile, and Dr. Rourke sitting with his hands folded like he was ready for court. And at the far end of the table, Commander Reyes sat upright, eyes steady, posture controlled. He looked out of place in the sterile corporate room, and yet somehow the room seemed to bend around him. Reyes' gaze locked onto Yoonji. Sit. Yoonji walked in and sat without asking permission. Rourke's eyes narrowed. Danielle cleared her throat. This meeting is to address concerns regarding. Reyes held up a hand, not aggressive, just absolute. Danielle stopped mid-sentence like she'd hit a wall. Reyes spoke calmly. This meeting is to address why you removed Nurse Park from duty after she prevented a catastrophic outcome. The attorney's smile tightened. Commander Reyes, we respect your... Reyes turned his head slightly. Respect is behavior, not words. Silence fell. Harrow leaned back slightly, watching. Valerie's heart pounded, but she kept her face neutral. Danielle tried again. We have policies, scope of practice. Reyes nodded once. Good policies, let's talk about them. He slid a folder across the table. It landed in front of the attorney. The attorney opened it and his face changed. Reyes's voice stayed even. That is the timeline, the vitals, the echo findings, the order entries, the documentation, the audio from the secured trauma bay feed. Danielle's face paled. We don't. Reyes's eyes stayed on her. You do when you want it, and when you don't want it, you pretend it doesn't exist. Rourke's voice cut in sharp. Are you recording in trauma bays? That's a violation. Harrow's gaze snapped to Rourke. Security feed is standard in high-risk areas, you know that. Rourke's mouth opened, then closed. Reyes turned to Rourke. Doctor, you filed the report. Rourke's chin lifted. I filed a patient safety concern. Reyes nodded slowly. Then you won't mind us examining your statements. Rourke's eyes flicked to the folder, then back. Nurse Park delayed CT. Yoonji spoke quietly. I recommended stabilization. Dr. Harrow agreed. Rourke's eyes flashed. You're not a physician. Yoonji's voice stayed calm. And you weren't the attending. Rourke's face reddened. Danielle tried to interject. We're not here to... Reyes leaned forward slightly. We are here to decide whether this hospital will correct an injustice quietly, or whether we will do it in a way that becomes very public. The attorney swallowed. Commander, we don't want publicity. Reyes nodded, then act like it. For the first time, Danielle's composure cracked. Why is this so important to you? She's a nurse. Reyes's eyes moved to Yoonji, and the room held its breath without realizing it. He answered, quiet but clear, because she's not just a nurse. Pause. The room didn't know how to take that. Harrow's eyes narrowed. Valerie's heart stuttered. The attorney looked wary. Danielle looked confused. Rourke looked offended. Commander, the attorney said carefully, what exactly are you implying? Reyes didn't look at him. He looked at Yoonji. Do you want to tell them, or should I? Yoonji's jaw tightened. I left that life. Reyes's voice softened, but the steel stayed. That life found you again the moment you kept Cross alive. Danielle blinked. I'm sorry, what life? Reyes reached into his jacket and placed something on the table. A small patch. Black, subdued, the kind meant not to be seen unless you were close enough to matter. It read, Whisper. Rourke's mouth opened in a laugh that died halfway. Is this a joke? Reyes turned his head toward him slowly. Do you think I joke about callsigns? Rourke swallowed. Reyes's voice stayed even. Nurse Park served as a tactical communications specialist embedded with special operations medical elements. She was trained to coordinate casualty care under hostile conditions, to triage when seconds decide outcomes, and to keep people alive long enough to reach surgeons like Dr. Harrow. Danielle's eyes widened. That's not possible, she's a nurse. Yoonji's voice was quiet. I'm still a nurse. Reyes nodded, and she was also the person who kept our medics connected when everything else failed. Valerie stared at Yoonji like she was seeing her for the first time. Yoonji. Harrow's expression shifted, understanding clicking into place. That storm night, the way you moved. Yoonji didn't look away. She didn't deny it. Rourke's voice was sharp with disbelief. So what? That doesn't change hospital policy. Reyes's eyes turned cold. It changes one thing, Doctor. Rourke held his gaze stubborn. What? Reyes's voice lowered. It means you mocked someone whose competence was earned in places you wouldn't last 10 minutes. Silence. And then Reyes did something the room didn't expect. He stood. He faced Yoonji. And in a conference room full of hospital administrators and physicians, he lifted his hand in a crisp, controlled salute. It wasn't theatrical. It was dignity. Yoonji's throat tightened. Her eyes stayed steady, but her breathing shifted slightly, like the past had reached out and touched her shoulder. Reyes spoke quietly. Whisper, thank you for bringing my commander home alive. Danielle's face went pale. Your commander. Reyes nodded. Adrian Cross is a SEAL commander, and he is alive because Nurse Park prevented an unnecessary transport that would have tipped him into arrest. The attorney swallowed hard. We had no idea. Reyes's gaze cut through him. You didn't ask. Rourke's voice came out smaller. So he's military, that doesn't mean. Reyes turned toward him. It means your report is not just wrong, it is malicious. Rourke's face tightened. I was acting in good faith. Harrow's voice cut in, calm and lethal. Then why did you omit my decision-making in your report, Caleb? Rourke froze. Valerie added, voice shaking with anger. And why did you publicly teach about scope during rounds like she was a cautionary tale? Danielle's eyes darted between them. We need to stay professional. Yoonji finally spoke, and her voice was soft but carried. I want to stay professional, she said. That's why I didn't respond when I was mocked. That's why I documented instead of arguing, but I won't be punished for doing my job. Her gaze landed on Danielle. I won't be made into a liability because a doctor felt small. Rourke's face flushed. And that's when the room changed again. Because it wasn't just about Yoonji anymore. It was about the hospital admitting what it rewarded and what it punished. If you're hooked right now, subscribe and stay with me. The reveal is only the pivot. The real satisfaction is watching what happens when the system has to correct itself in public. Pause. Commander Reyes didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Authority like his didn't rely on volume. It relied on inevitability. He sat back down and folded his hands. Here's what's going to happen. Danielle tried to reclaim control. Commander, you can't dictate internal. Reyes looked at her. I can dictate whether this hospital ever receives another contract for specialized military medical coordination. I can dictate whether your board hears about how you treated a decorated service member working as a civilian nurse. I can dictate whether your public relations department spends the next month answering questions you don't want asked. The attorney's smile had vanished completely. We'd like to resolve this amicably. Reyes nodded once, then resolve it. Harrow slid a printed copy of Yoonji's documentation across the table. This is her charting, time-stamped. It shows she raised concern. It shows I agreed. It shows the patient stabilized. It shows outcome. Valerie added, and here's the staffing log. Yoonji was assigned to the bay. She acted within nursing practice by alerting the team to instability and recommending stabilization. Rourke's voice turned defensive. She said wait like she was ordering me. Yoonji looked at him, calm. I said wait because the patient was decompensating. I would say it again. Rourke's eyes flashed with anger and embarrassment. You're enjoying this. Yoonji's voice stayed level. No, I'm tired. That single sentence hit harder than any argument. Danielle rubbed her forehead. This has gotten out of hand. Reyes's tone stayed cool. It got out of hand when you punished the person who prevented a code. The attorney cleared his throat. We can rescind the administrative leave. Valerie leaned forward. Not enough. The attorney blinked. Excuse me. Valerie's voice was steady. You don't just bring her back and pretend nothing happened. He smeared her reputation. He set a precedent that nurses should keep quiet even when they see danger. Harrow nodded. There needs to be correction. Danielle's eyes widened. What are you asking for? Harrow's voice was calm. A formal retraction of the incident report, removal from her file, and a documented statement that Nurse Park acted appropriately. Valerie added, and a review of Dr. Rourke's conduct, not just this report, the pattern. Rourke's head snapped up. Pattern, that's ridiculous. Yoonji's gaze stayed on him. It is. Rourke turned toward Danielle, voice sharp. Are you letting a nurse accuse me? Danielle looked trapped between politics and truth. Reyes broke the stalemate. You'll conduct a review, you'll interview staff, you'll pull the documentation, you'll check the camera feed. The attorney hesitated. We have to consider physician training. Harrow's eyes hardened. Training doesn't excuse retaliation. Reyes's voice lowered. And if you decide to sweep it under the rug, I will personally request an external review from every oversight body that applies. Danielle swallowed hard. We will conduct a review. Reyes nodded. Good. Rourke's face had gone tight, his confidence cracking at the edges. This is disproportionate. Yoonji spoke softly. So was punishing me. Rourke stared at her like he wanted to say something cruel, but the room was too full of witnesses now. And witnesses were what made justice possible. Pause. The review didn't take weeks. Not when Commander Reyes was sitting in the lobby, with a quiet intensity that made administrators move faster than they ever moved for nurses. By that evening, Yoonji was reinstated. By the next morning, the incident report was formally labeled unsubstantiated, and the hospital issued an internal memo clarifying that nurses were expected to speak up about patient instability, and that doing so was not insubordination. But Rourke wasn't finished yet. He tried one last tactic, turning the culture against her. He cornered a group of residents and spoke in a low, bitter voice. She's got military friends, that's all this is. Pull strings, get special treatment. One of the residents, a young woman named Dr. Priya Sen, frowned. Or she saved a life and you tried to punish her. Rourke's eyes flashed. Careful, you don't want to get labeled difficult. Priya's gaze stayed steady. I'd rather be difficult than wrong. Rourke's smile was thin. You'll learn. The words carried threat. And that's when Harrow decided to stop being patient. He called a meeting with the residency program director, Dr. Alina Cho, a physician known for being fair in a way that made bullies nervous. Dr. Cho reviewed the documentation, the audio, the camera feed. Then she requested witness statements. Valerie wrote hers with shaking hands, not from fear but from anger. Harrow wrote his with surgical precision. Priya wrote hers with blunt honesty. Even Dr. Patel added a note emphasizing Yoonji's clinical judgment. Rourke, meanwhile, tried to preempt the review by filing a second complaint, that Yoonji had breached confidentiality by speaking to Commander Reyes. That complaint died quickly when security logs showed that the patient himself requested the call, and that Reyes was authorized as part of the patient's protected detail. Rourke's tactics were collapsing, one by one, under the weight of documentation. And documentation was Yoonji's language. The final blow came from someone no one expected. A new nurse barely off orientation, named Tessa Morales, asked to speak to Dr. Cho privately. Tessa was shy, the kind of person who apologized when other people bumped into her, but her hands were clenched when she walked into Cho's office. She told Cho about a night 2 months earlier when Rourke had humiliated Yoonji at the nurse's station, mocking her quiet voice, telling her she didn't belong in trauma. Tessa said Yoonji had stayed calm and simply returned to her work. But afterward, Tessa had seen Yoonji in the supply room, alone, leaning against the shelves for a moment with her eyes closed. Not crying, just steadying herself. Tessa's voice shook. I thought it was normal, I thought that's how it is, but then I saw what she did with Commander Cross, and I realized she's not weak, she's just controlled, and he's been punishing her for it. Cho listened without interrupting. When Tessa finished, Cho nodded once. Thank you for telling me. Tessa swallowed. Am I going to get in trouble? Cho's voice was calm. No, you just did the right thing. And that's when the room changed again, in a different way. Because the system wasn't just hearing about a single incident anymore. It was hearing about a culture. If you're still with me, take a second to comment, whisper. If you think Yoonji deserves more than reinstatement, if you think she deserves a real apology and real accountability. I want to see how many of you are ready for the kind of justice that actually sticks. Pause. While the hospital's wheels of accountability turned, Adrian Cross lay in the ICU, awake more often now, still guarded. Yoonji was assigned to him again, and that choice was deliberate. It wasn't just about her competence. It was about trust. Cross's room was quiet, lights dimmed, the hum of equipment steady. To secure it. Why men sat outside the door, and every time a staff member approached, they were assessed with a glance that felt like a scan. Cross watched Yoonji with a focus that made most patients uncomfortable, but Yoonji didn't flinch. How's the pressure? She asked softly, checking his vitals. Better, he said. His voice was rough but steadier. You're still here. Yoonji nodded. I'm still here. He studied her face. You disappeared. Yoonji's hands paused briefly on the IV line. I left the military. Cross's eyes narrowed. That's not what I mean. Yoonji looked at him, calm. Then what do you mean? Cross exhaled slowly. You were the voice in Kandahar, night flights, dust storms, comms cutting in and out, the one who kept the medevac line open. Yoonji didn't respond immediately. The room felt smaller. Cross's gaze stayed on her. I heard you last night in the bay, same cadence. Yoonji's voice was quiet. I didn't know you were there. Cross's mouth twitched. You weren't supposed to. Yoonji's eyes lowered, then lifted again. What happened to you? Why were you exerting yourself with inflammation around your heart? Cross's expression hardened. Because the job doesn't stop when your body wants to. Yoonji's voice stayed neutral. Your body will stop it for you if you keep pushing. Cross's gaze flicked to the monitor, then back. You always talked like that. Yoonji adjusted his oxygen, gentle. It's still true. Cross's voice lowered. They put you on leave. Yoonji's jaw tightened slightly. They tried. Cross's eyes sharpened. Who? Yoonji didn't answer. Cross's voice stayed calm, but there was an edge. Yoonji, who tried to punish you for saving my life. Yoonji met his gaze. It's being handled. Cross's mouth tightened. Handled by who? Yoonji didn't want to involve him. That was part of her old discipline. Protect the mission, protect the patient, don't bring personal conflict into the medical space. But Cross wasn't just a patient, he was a commander. And commanders didn't like being kept in the dark. Dr. Rourke filed a complaint, Yoonji said quietly. Cross's eyes went flat. Rourke. The way he repeated the name was a promise. Yoonji's tone stayed even. Commander, you need to focus on your recovery. Cross nodded once as if he heard her, but his gaze stayed sharp. You're still whisper. Yoonji's throat tightened. No. Cross's voice was quiet. You can deny the patch, you can deny the past, but you can't deny what you are under pressure. Yoonji's eyes held his. Under pressure, I'm a nurse. Cross's mouth twitched again. That's the same thing in your case. Pause. The day the residency review hearing was scheduled, the hospital felt like it was holding its breath. Not because people loved drama. Because people understood what it meant when a resident like Rourke was questioned. It meant either the system would finally draw a line, or it would prove again that loud confidence mattered more than quiet competence. The hearing wasn't in a courtroom, but it might as well have been. A conference room with a long table. Dr. Cho at the head, program director authority in her posture. A representative from HR. A representative from nursing leadership. Risk management lurking like a shadow. Valerie sat on one side with her shoulders squared, hands clasped to keep them from trembling. Harrow sat beside her, face unreadable. Rourke sat opposite, jaw tight, wearing the expression of someone who believed he was being unfairly attacked. Yoonji was invited to attend, but she chose not to sit at the table. She sat against the wall, quiet, hands folded, like she was observing a room the way she always had, seeing what people did when they thought they had power. Cho began. This review concerns allegations of unprofessional conduct, retaliation, and inaccurate documentation. Rourke's voice was controlled. I deny those allegations. Cho nodded. We'll proceed with facts. Dr. Harrow described the clinical timeline. Harrow did calm and precise, detailing the instability, the echo findings, the decision to stabilize before transport, the pericardiocentesis. Cho asked, did Nurse Park act outside her scope? Harrow's answer was clear. No, she identified instability and communicated it. That is within nursing practice and expected in trauma care. Cho turned to Valerie. Do you believe the incident report was filed in good faith? Valerie's voice was steady, but the anger was under it. No, I believe it was retaliation. Rourke's eyes flashed. That's. Cho held up a hand. You'll have your chance. Valerie continued. Dr. Rourke has repeatedly mocked Nurse Park, interrupted her reports, and undermined her in front of staff. This is the first time it escalated into formal paperwork because his ego was bruised. Rourke's face reddened. You can't prove that. Cho nodded to HR. We can review witness statements. Witnesses spoke. Priya, Tessa. even a respiratory therapist who admitted he'd heard Rourke call Yoon. I mute behind her back. With each statement, Rourke's posture tightened. His confidence was draining, replaced by defensive anger. Cho finally turned to him. Dr. Rourke, why did you omit Dr. Harrow's decision from your incident report? Rourke's voice sharpened, because the focus was on communication breakdown. Cho's eyes didn't move. Why did you frame Nurse Park's recommendation as a delay when the attending agreed with her? Rourke's jaw worked, because it created confusion. Cho's tone stayed calm. Did it create confusion or did it create embarrassment? Rourke's eyes flashed. This is unfair. Cho leaned forward slightly. What's unfair is using documentation as a weapon. Silence. Then Cho said, you are being placed on remediation for professionalism and documentation integrity. Your incident report is being retracted and corrected in the system. Any further retaliation will result in termination from the program. Rourke's face went pale. You can't. Cho's voice stayed even. You're a physician in training, and training includes character. Rourke's eyes darted to Yoonji on the wall. For the first time, his gaze held uncertainty. Because he realized something too late. Yoonji didn't need to fight him loudly. She just needed to let the truth exist long enough to be seen. Pause. Rourke didn't accept defeat gracefully. He didn't storm out shouting, because that would confirm everything. Instead, he moved quietly through the hospital after the hearing like a man who believed he could still salvage his image. He approached nurses with forced friendliness. He spoke to residents with careful humility. He tried to reframe the outcome as a learning opportunity. But people weren't buying it. Because the story had traveled, as stories always did in hospitals. Not in gossip, but in that quiet, shared awareness staff developed when something revealed the true nature of the place they worked. And Yoonji's name traveled too. Not as quiet, as competent, as the nurse who held a SEAL commander awake with her voice. As whisper, that call sign didn't become public, not officially, but it lived in the margins, in the way certain staff looked at Yoonji now, in the way a few veterans in the unit nodded at her with new respect, in the way even Harrow listened a beat longer when she spoke. Yoonji didn't change her behavior, that was the thing. She didn't start talking louder. She didn't start demanding recognition. She didn't turn her competence into performance. She just kept working. That consistency became its own kind of authority. One night, a new patient came in, young, panicked, short of breath. His girlfriend was crying. A resident started speaking too fast, overwhelming him. Yoonji stepped close, lowered her voice, and said, "Listen to me. Look at me, breathe with me." The patient's breathing slowed. The resident stared like he'd just watched a magic trick. Yoonji didn't look up. She just adjusted the mask and kept the patient anchored. And that's when the room changed again, not with spectacle, but with a quiet shift of respect. If you've made it this far, subscribe for more stories where justice is earned with discipline, not drama. And if you want, tell me in the comments, have you ever seen someone underestimated because they were quiet? Pause. Adrian Cross improved steadily. The effusion didn't recur after treatment. The inflammation markers began to fall. He stayed in ICU longer than the average patient, not just for medical reasons, but because of the security considerations. Reyes visited daily, but he never hovered. He asked precise questions. He listened. He respected Yoonji's nursing judgment without trying to turn her into a symbol. On the 5th day, Cross asked Yoonji a question when Reyes wasn't there. "Why did you leave?" he said. Yoonji checked his IV site, then his vitals. "Because I wanted a life that didn't require me to be invisible." Cross's brow furrowed. "You're invisible here too." Yoonji's mouth softened, not quite a smile. "Different kind." Cross's voice was quieter. "You were good at being invisible when it mattered." Yoonji's hands paused, "And it cost me." Cross watched her. "What did it cost you?" Yoonji's gaze drifted to the window where Seattle's gray sky hung low. "People assume quiet means weak. They assume you're safe to blame." Cross's jaw tightened. "You let them." Yoonji looked back at him. "Sometimes letting them is safer than proving them wrong." Cross's eyes narrowed. "Not always." Yoonji didn't answer. Because that was the truth she'd been avoiding. Later that day, Reyes arrived with a folder. He handed it to Yoonji without fanfare. For you. Yoonji looked at him. What is it? Reyes' voice stayed neutral. A letter and a recommendation. Yoonji's throat tightened. Commander, I don't want. Reyes cut in gently. It's not a medal. It's a formal acknowledgement for the hospital, for your file, so no one can rewrite what you did. Yoonji stared at the folder. For a long moment. She didn't take it. Then she did. She didn't open it in front of him. She wasn't ready. Reyes' gaze stayed steady. You're not a tool, Yoonji. You're a professional, and professionals deserve protection. Yoonji's voice came out soft. Thank you. Reyes nodded once. Cross will want to see you when he's discharged. Yoonji blinked. Me. Reyes' expression softened. He's a commander. He doesn't forget who kept him alive. Pause. The discharge day came with a strange kind of quiet ceremony. No press, no announcements, no cameras. But there were witnesses anyway. Valerie made sure Yoonji was scheduled that morning. Harrow happened to be doing rounds at the same time. Dr. Patel stopped by. Priya lingered near the nurses' station. Even Danielle Sloan appeared in the hallway, face composed, eyes slightly too alert, as if she'd learned what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the truth. Cross stood by the bed, dressed in plain clothes, still slightly pale but upright. The hospital gown was folded on the chair like a discarded skin. Reyes stood beside him. Cross looked around the room, then at Yoonji. You ready? Yoonji blinked. For what? Cross's mouth twitched. To stop letting people decide who you are. Yoonji's jaw tightened. I'm fine. Cross nodded as if he expected that answer. You know what the hardest part was in the bay. Yoonji shook her head. Cross's eyes held hers. Not the pain, not the fear. It was hearing you get dismissed while you were saving me. Yoonji's throat tightened. It's not about me. Cross's voice was quiet. That's what you always say, and that's why people use you. A pause. Then Cross turned slightly, addressing the room. Not like a patient, like a leader. I'm alive because Nurse Yoonji Park did what professionals do, he said. She observed, she spoke up. She stayed calm. She kept me conscious when my body wanted to quit. He looked at Danielle Sloan, eyes steady. If your system punishes that, your system is broken. Danielle's face flushed. Commander, we've corrected. Cross lifted a hand. Danielle stopped, the way she had with Reyes, because authority recognized authority. Cross looked back at Yoonji. And I'm not leaving without saying this where people can hear it. He stepped closer. His posture straightened. And then in the ICU room in front of staff, he lifted his hand in a crisp salute. Not to Reyes. To Yoonji. It wasn't theatrical. It was controlled, deliberate, a moment carved clean. Whispered, Cross said quietly, You brought me back. Yoonji's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She didn't break. She simply held the moment with the same discipline she'd held the trauma bay. Reyes stood beside Cross and mirrored the salute. Two SEAL commanders saluting a nurse. The room went still. Even Harrow's eyes softened. Valerie's throat tightened painfully. And Yoonji finally allowed herself a small, dignified nod. Not submission. Acknowledgement. And that's when the room changed for the last time. Pause. After Cross and Reyes left, the hospital didn't return to normal. Not immediately. Because once you see the truth of someone, you can't unsee it. Nurses stopped calling Yoonji quiet like it meant fragile. They called her calm. They asked her opinion more. They listened when she spoke, even if she spoke softly. Residents, at least the ones worth training, began to treat her like what she was, an expert in her domain. Rourke on remediation kept his head down. He avoided Yoonji in hallways. When he did have to interact, his voice was clipped and formal, like he was afraid of his own past behavior. One night, weeks later, Rourke found Yoonji alone by the medication room. He hesitated, then spoke, Nurse Park. Yoonji looked up, Dr. Rourke. Rourke swallowed, I was wrong. Yoonji didn't respond immediately. Rourke's voice tightened, pushing through pride. I let my insecurity become aggression. Yoonji's eyes stayed steady. Yes. Rourke flinched at the directness. Yoonji continued softly. You don't need to confess to me. You need to change how you treat people who can't protect themselves from your authority. Rourke's face reddened. I'm trying. Yoonji nodded once. Good. She turned back to her work. Rourke stood there, then left quietly. It wasn't a Hollywood redemption. It wasn't dramatic. It was what real accountability looked like. Uncomfortable, ongoing, unglamorous. Valerie later told Yoonji, you know what you did. Yoonji blinked, my job. Valerie shook her head. No, you reminded people that calm competence is power, and you made them respect it. Yoonji's gaze drifted to the trauma bay doors across the unit. The doors that slammed open every night with someone's crisis. I didn't make them, Yoonji said softly. They chose to. Valerie smiled, eyes bright, and you let them. Yoonji's mouth softened, not quite a smile. Maybe. If this story left you feeling that warmth after the vindication, if you like narratives where justice is procedural, earned, and satisfying, so be scribe for more. And if you want to watch next, look for the next story where a nobody gets underestimated until the person with real authority walks in and changes the entire room. Pause. Yoonji never put the patch on her uniform. She didn't need to. Her authority wasn't stitched to her chest. It lived in her habits, in her documentation, in her steadiness, in the way she held patients' fear without absorbing it. But once, months later, a veteran patient asked her quietly, were you in? Yoonji paused, then nodded once. The man's eyes softened. I knew it. Yoonji adjusted his blanket. How? The man's voice was gentle. You don't flinch when the alarms go off. You don't talk like you're trying to prove something. You talk like you're trying to get people home. Yoonji's throat tightened. She didn't respond with a story. She responded with care. Because that was her moral, the one she lived instead of preached. Humility isn't silence, and service isn't weakness. Integrity is doing the right thing even when it's inconvenient, and professionalism is refusing to become cruel just because cruelty is rewarded in the moment. Yoonji stayed quiet in the way that mattered. Not because she couldn't speak, because she didn't need to shout to be heard anymore. And somewhere out in the city, two commanders remembered the voice that kept them steady when the world was loud. Whisper. Final thought, and then I'll let you go. If you want more long, high-retention, fictional stories where the underestimated person gets their dignity back without losing their calm, like this one, subscribe and tell me what injustice you want to see reversed next.